The Riddle of the Docks, a Sherlock Holmes mystery from the reminiscences of John H. Watson, M.D., in the style of Arthur Conan Doyle. Part 1, The First Body. It was an unremarkable Thursday morning when Mycroft Holmes, the elder and far more sedentary brother of Sherlock, received a peculiar telegram. A. Would you like more of this Sherlock Holmes mystery? B. Are you interested in exploring the characters of Mycroft and Sherlock more? C. Would you like to discuss the writing style of Arthur Conan Doyle? He had been sitting in his usual place at the Diogenes Club, his refuge from the world of bustling London. The club, with its thick curtains drawn and its peculiar membership, provided Mycroft with a space in which he could ponder the intricacies of statecraft. He had grown used to the noise of government affairs, those tiresome discussions on foreign policy, trade, and the public good. But on this morning, the telegram he received would disturb his solitude in a manner that would prove to be rather unsettling. The message, written in the familiar cryptic manner that one might expect from Scotland Yard, read, "Body found. Thames, docks near Wapping. Male, dressed in seaman's garb. Unexplained marks. Your presence requested immediately. Lestrade." A shiver ran down Mycroft's spine. Though he was hardly a man of action, he knew well the implications of such a message. A body found in the Thames was rarely a simple case. In the heart of London's busy docks, where ships came and went from across the world, such discoveries usually carried a darker undertone. Mycroft allowed himself a moment of contemplation. He could easily have dispatched one of his government aides to investigate, but his intuition told him that this case might involve more than the usual sordid affair. His brother Sherlock, of course, would likely be involved soon enough, but Mycroft had always prided himself on his own ability to discern the true significance of events before his younger sibling ever had a chance to do so. With a reluctant sigh, he stood, donned his overcoat, and made his way out into the cold morning air. The scene that greeted him when he arrived was grim. The Thames, so often a vital artery of London, had delivered its first victim of what would prove to be a much more complicated puzzle. Mycroft's eyes narrowed as he surveyed the body lying at the edge of the river. Detective Lestrade stood at the scene, looking far less composed than usual. His eyes, though seasoned by years of investigating all manner of crime, betrayed a degree of unease. "Mr. Holmes," Lestrade greeted, his voice heavy with the weight of an unsolved mystery. "We've got a bit of a situation here." Mycroft nodded slowly, allowing his sharp gaze to linger on the body. The man was indeed dressed as a sailor, his clothes damp and heavy with river water. His face, pale and contorted, bore a strange set of marks, deep, circular bruises around his neck, and a set of cuts across his hands that seemed far too precise to have been made by a common blade. "What do we know about him?" Mycroft asked, his voice even and controlled, betraying none of the discomfort he felt at the sight of the body. Lestrade cleared his throat, shuffling his feet. "We've identified him as Edward Brant, a sailor who was last seen 2 days ago at the dock, preparing to board the ship SS Orion. His shipmates reported nothing unusual, and there were no signs of struggle aboard the ship. There's no evidence of robbery, but these marks on his neck." He trailed off, unsure of how to continue. Mycroft stepped forward, his analytical mind already piecing together the details. "A strangulation, but not by ordinary means. The marks are too uniform for that." Lestrade nodded. "That's what we thought. And these cuts on his hands, they look deliberate, as though he was trying to grab something that was taken from him." Mycroft gave a thoughtful grunt, his gaze fixed on the body. "And you say he was last seen on board the SS Orion?" "Yes, sir." "Perhaps his death is connected to something aboard that ship," Mycroft mused aloud. "It is not uncommon for sailors to become embroiled in disputes, but these marks on his neck suggest something far more calculated." Lestrade nodded, his face grim. "I was hoping you might be able to shed some light on this. We've already sent for the coroner, but it's going to take a while before we can be certain about the cause of death." Mycroft turned his attention to the surrounding area. The fog was thick this morning, making it difficult to see much beyond a few feet. His gaze lingered on the dock's wooden planks, the creaking of the old boards beneath him, a constant reminder of the city's murky past. He glanced over at Lestrade again. "Have you spoken to anyone else who might have witnessed this?" "Other sailors?" The dock workers? Mycroft inquired, his voice steady and probing. Lestrade scratched his head, clearly flustered. Not yet, but we've been focusing on the body itself. It's strange, Mr. Holmes. This doesn't feel like your ordinary murder. There's something else at play here. Before Mycroft could respond, a familiar figure emerged from the mist, his silhouette sharp and unmistakable. It was none other than Sherlock Holmes, his features as sharp as ever, despite the early hour. "Good morning, Mycroft," Sherlock greeted with a slight, wry smile. "I see you've already made some observations." Mycroft glanced at his younger brother. Sherlock's entrance was as fortuitous as ever. The younger Holmes was always quick to grasp the significance of such moments. "Indeed," Mycroft replied coolly, stepping aside to let Sherlock approach the body. "It seems we have a rather curious case on our hands. This man, Edward Brant, was not merely the victim of a random murder. There is method to it. A deliberate pattern I suspect we are about to uncover." Sherlock, eyes narrowed, crouched beside the body. "Indeed, Mycroft, the marks on the neck indicate a professional. This was no mere act of violence. Someone knew what they were doing." Lestrade, still fidgeting, finally broke his silence. "I've sent for the coroner, but we're not sure what we're dealing with here. It's not just the strangulation, it's the cuts on the hands, and the victim's clothing. Nothing was stolen, but he doesn't appear to be a man of wealth." Sherlock stood up, his mind clearly racing. "Interesting. And yet, you've already mentioned the SS Orion. I wonder if the victim's death is connected to something more than just a random encounter. Could it be possible that Brant came across something on that ship, something that would make him a target?" Mycroft stepped forward, his brow furrowing. "I believe you're on the right track, Sherlock. The man's death was no accident. His fate may very well have been sealed aboard that very ship. We must find out what happened during his last few hours before his body ended up here." Sherlock shot his brother a quick glance. "And we shall, Mycroft. It seems the game is afoot once more." Part 2. The investigation deepens. The morning had barely broken, and already Mycroft Holmes was certain that his day would be far from ordinary. As the fog continued to curl around the docks, clinging to the decrepit structures as if it were part of the very foundation, the air was thick with the promise of something far more complex than the simple mystery it initially appeared to be. Sherlock, ever the perceptive investigator, stood apart from the others, his sharp eyes scanning the scene with that rare intensity that could find a needle in a haystack. Mycroft, who had always prided himself on his intellect, was beginning to appreciate the work of his brother more than ever. Sherlock's mind worked in ways that defied simple logic. He saw patterns where others saw only chaos. Lestrade, fidgeting nervously, approached Mycroft once again, his expression one of frustration and confusion. "Mr. Holmes, we've managed to gather some preliminary information, but I'm afraid it doesn't offer much more than we already know." Mycroft gave him a brief, almost imperceptible nod, his mind already processing the new details. "What do you have?" Lestrade handed Mycroft a small ledger, worn and weathered from its journey through various hands. "It's a list of the crew aboard the SS Orion. As it turns out, Brant wasn't the only one missing. 2 others haven't been seen since last night, though it's not clear yet whether they have anything to do with the murder." Mycroft took the ledger, flipping through it with the steady rhythm of a man accustomed to sifting through information for hidden meaning. The crew list was, at first glance, unremarkable. Dozens of names, many of them foreign, a mix of sailors from various countries and backgrounds. But Mycroft had learned long ago that nothing was truly unremarkable, particularly in the world of crime and conspiracy. He paused at a few familiar names, men who had made their marks in London's underbelly and notorious for their involvement in illegal dealings or smuggling rings. These names stood out like red flags against the otherwise mundane list. One such name was Samuel "Sammy" Dunlop, a seaman with a reputation that preceded him. Dunlop was known for his connections to certain criminal circles in the East End, but his name had also appeared on several government reports concerning illicit trade routes. The SS Orion appears to be a ship of interest, then. Mycroft mused aloud, turning the ledger over in his hands. "We must investigate the connections between these crew members and the ship's operations more thoroughly." Lestrade, though eager to cooperate, looked unsettled. You mean? Yes, Mycroft interrupted, his gaze fixed on the names before him. I believe we may be dealing with a series of connected crimes. A smuggling ring, perhaps. And if Brant stumbled onto something, well, that would make him a very dangerous man indeed, when his death may have been far more than just a robbery gone wrong. Sherlock, who had been pacing the perimeter of the scene, finally spoke, his voice cutting through the fog like a blade. Your deductions are, as usual, sharp, Mycroft. But the real question now is, who would be involved in something like this? And why was Brant the one to be silenced? Mycroft turned his attention to his brother, noting the way Sherlock's eyes narrowed with suspicion. The answer to that, Sherlock, lies in the SS Orion. I suspect that Brant found something, whether it was on board or in the dealings surrounding it, that he shouldn't have. And now, with him gone, whoever is behind this will go to great lengths to ensure that no one else gets too close to the truth. Sherlock gave a small, sardonic smile. As ever, your deduction is precise. But what about the other missing men? Surely their disappearances are no coincidence. Exactly, Mycroft agreed, his mind already racing ahead. These disappearances are likely connected, and they may be the key to understanding Brant's death. I suggest we begin by speaking to the remaining crew members. We will see what their stories tell us. As Sherlock and Mycroft prepared to leave the scene and head toward the docks, where the SS Orion was berthed, Lestrade remained behind, supervising the arrival of the coroner and ensuring that the body was properly handled. The fog grew thicker as the Holmes brothers made their way toward the docks. The sounds of the city seemed muffled, absorbed by the heavy mist that clung to everything, making the familiar streets of London feel unfamiliar. Their destination lay ahead, the bulk of the ship looming like a shadow, its tall masts obscured by the fog. Sherlock, ever the keen observer, kept his thoughts to himself as they walked, but Mycroft could tell that his brother was already deep in thought. They arrived at the ship's berth after a short while, the SS Orion listing slightly in the water. It was an unremarkable vessel at first glance, its hull worn from years of travel across the globe. Yet there was an unsettling quality to it, as though the ship itself held a secret that it was eager to keep hidden. A tall, broad-shouldered man emerged from the gangplank as they approached. His features were weathered and worn, his eyes narrow and distrustful. He wore the uniform of a ship's captain, though Mycroft noticed that his hands were stained with something dark, a substance that looked all too much like blood. "Captain Barrow, I presume?" Sherlock inquired, his voice steady and commanding. The man gave a curt nod, his gaze flicking between the two Holmes brothers with a wary wariness. "Aye, that's me. You're the one sent by the Yard, aren't ye?" Mycroft stepped forward, his hand outstretched. "Mr. Lestrade sent us. We are investigating the death of Edward Brant, one of your crew members." Barrow's face darkened at the mention of Brant's name, and his hand instinctively tightened around the ship's railing. "I've heard the news," he said grimly, "but I'll tell you this. Brant wasn't a troublemaker. He kept to himself, did his work. Whatever happened to him, it wasn't because of anything he did aboard this ship." Sherlock's eyes narrowed. "And yet, you seem troubled, Captain. You know more than you're letting on." Barrow stiffened. "I don't know what you're implying, but I'll tell you right now. I've got a crew to look after. I've been on these waters too long to get tangled up in any nonsense." "Your tone betrays your words," Sherlock replied coolly, stepping closer to the captain. "I think you know exactly what I'm implying. You may have been involved in something far deeper than you realize." Mycroft's eyes flicked from Barrow to the ship, his mind working rapidly. "We are not here to accuse you, Captain. We simply want to know the truth. Where were you and your crew last night?" Barrow hesitated for a moment, his eyes darting to the side, before he spoke in a low voice. "We were docked at Wapping. There was no sign of trouble, no arguments, no fights, just a normal night on board. I don't know what happened to Brant, but it wasn't anything to do with us." Sherlock stepped closer, his piercing gaze never leaving Barrow's face. "Then tell me, Captain, who else aboard this ship might have a reason to harm Brant? Was there anyone who had a particular grievance with him?" Barrow seemed to swallow hard before answering. "Well, there's always someone, isn't there? But I swear on my life, Brant didn't have any enemies on board. He was just a sailor minding his business. But there's something off about the whole thing. Something I can't put my finger on. Sherlock turned to his brother, his expression unreadable. Mycroft nodded almost imperceptibly. The captain's hesitancy was telling, but it wasn't enough to accuse him just yet. However, it was clear that the SS Orion was no ordinary merchant ship. It was a vessel with secrets that could very well be connected to Brant's death. "Thank you, Captain," Sherlock said, his voice smooth. "We'll need to speak to your crew members. If you have any information, I trust you'll share it with us." Barrow gave a curt nod, his face drawn with concern. "I'll have them come to you, but mark my words, if there's something darker going on here, you'll find it. Just be careful." With that, the Holmes brothers turned and walked back down the gangplank, the weight of the case settling upon them. The investigation was deepening, and with each passing moment, it became more apparent that this was no ordinary murder. It was a puzzle, one that stretched beyond the death of Edward Brant into something far more dangerous and far-reaching. Part 3. The Tides of Mystery. The fog had not lifted by the time Sherlock and Mycroft made their way back into the heart of the city. The atmosphere, still dense and suffocating, matched the mood of the investigation perfectly. Every step felt heavier, and every glance they exchanged seemed to carry an unspoken understanding. This case was far from ordinary. The pieces of the puzzle were scattered, but no one had yet made sense of the larger picture. As they returned to Baker Street, Sherlock immediately retreated to his study, his mind racing. The scent of tobacco smoke and the slight tang of old books filled the room as he sat at his desk, rifling through papers, his brow furrowed in concentration. Mycroft, meanwhile, stood by the window, his arms crossed, gazing out at the city as though searching for answers in the distance. Sherlock finally broke the silence, his voice low, almost to himself. "There's more to this than just a murder, Mycroft. Something far more dangerous. It's almost as if someone is deliberately drawing us into this web, someone who knows exactly how to play us." Mycroft, who had been watching his brother intently, nodded. "The connections between the SS Orion and Brant's death are not random. That ship is part of something larger, something we have yet to fully understand. And with the disappearance of those two crew members, I fear we're dealing with a much deeper conspiracy." Sherlock stood abruptly, pushing his chair back with a groan of wood scraping on stone. "It's all too convenient, isn't it? The body washed up at the riverbank. The strange behavior of Captain Barrow. The missing men. All of it points to something bigger than just an isolated crime." Mycroft remained silent for a moment, then spoke with measured deliberation. "We should visit the shipping offices and examine the SS Orion's records. Whoever is orchestrating this must have left a trail, be it in financial dealings, cargo manifests, or something more. The ship's movements, its connections, could provide us with crucial information." Sherlock nodded in agreement. "Then we must move quickly. Time is of the essence, but I have a feeling this will not be the end of it." The following morning, the brothers set out for the shipping office, a bustling part of the London docks, where records and cargo details were kept under lock and key. The building itself was a dark, imposing structure, bricks soaked in the salt of the river, windows streaked with the residue of years of smog and grime. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of ink and parchment, and the faint echo of the river could be heard through the cracks in the old wooden walls. As they entered, they were greeted by a clerk, a weary-looking man in his 40s with a face that suggested he had seen far too many reports of disasters in his time. His tired eyes flicked between Mycroft and Sherlock before he spoke. "Can I help you, gents?" The tone was flat, disinterested. "My name is Mycroft Holmes," Mycroft said, stepping forward with the grace and confidence of someone who is accustomed to authority. "And this is my brother, Sherlock Holmes. We are investigating a series of recent events involving the SS Orion. We require access to your shipping records." The clerk raised an eyebrow, a momentary flicker of suspicion passing through his eyes. "The Orion, eh? That's not the sort of ship you want to be involved with, but I suppose the Yard's got its reasons for being interested in it." He shuffled through some papers on his desk, his fingers moving slowly as though he was weighing the decision. Finally, he sighed and pulled out a few folders. I'm not supposed to give this kind of information out to just anyone, but I'll make an exception for you two. Might as well let you see for yourselves. Sherlock's eyes never left the clerk, who seemed more and more reluctant to provide any useful details. Mycroft, however, simply smiled and waited. In moments like these, he knew that patience was just as valuable a tool as deduction. The clerk handed over the folders, his voice low. This is what we have. The ship's records for the last 6 months. If there's anything here that stands out, you're welcome to have a look. Mycroft skimmed the papers, his eyes scanning the names and locations with ease. He paused on a series of entries that made his heart skip a beat. One of the cargo manifests listed a shipment that had been delivered to a warehouse on the outskirts of Whitechapel, a location known for its shady dealings. There, a series of heavy crates were recorded as having been offloaded from the ship just days before Brant's death. This is interesting, Mycroft murmured, tapping the manifest with his finger. These crates were signed for by a man named William Rudd, a name I know all too well. He's a known associate of several criminal enterprises that deal with stolen goods. Aims the SS Orion is more involved in illicit trade than we realized. Sherlock leaned over, scrutinizing the document with his usual sharpness. William Rudd, you say? He's one of the key figures in the East End's underworld. We should speak to him immediately. If he has any connections to Brant, he might be able to shed light on what's really happening here. The clerk, watching their growing interest with concern, spoke up again. You'll find Rudd at his usual haunts, gentlemen. But be careful. He's a slippery one. I'd advise against a direct confrontation. Sherlock's lips curled into a small smile. Thank you for the advice. We will proceed with caution. As they left the shipping office, the pieces of the puzzle continued to shift in Sherlock's mind. He was more convinced than ever that Brant had uncovered something truly dangerous, and it was this discovery that had cost him his life. Part 4. Shadows in the East End. The East End was a far cry from the upper crust of London society, with its narrow, winding streets, overcrowded tenements, and a general sense of decay that seemed to suffuse the very air. But it was here that the truth of Brant's death seemed to lead, through a maze of hidden dealings, dark alleys, and unsavory characters. Sherlock and Mycroft arrived at the warehouse district near Whitechapel just as the sun began to set, casting a dim orange glow over the weathered buildings. Sherlock's eyes darted from one building to the next, his mind working rapidly as he assessed the best approach to locate William Rudd. They stopped in front of a grimy pub, its windows cracked and dimly lit, a sign swinging from an iron post that creaked in the breeze. This was the place, the last known location for Rudd. Inside, the air was thick with smoke, the clink of glasses and murmur of low voices filling the room. At the far corner, seated alone at a table, was a man with a shaven head, dressed in a long, weather-beaten coat. His eyes flickered briefly in Sherlock's direction before returning to the glass in front of him. That's Rudd, Sherlock muttered, his voice barely audible over the din. Mycroft glanced at his brother. You plan to approach him directly? Not yet, Sherlock replied, his eyes narrowing. We need information first, not confrontation. Let's observe him for a moment longer. As they stood there, watching Rudd, the puzzle pieces began to fall into place. It was becoming clearer by the second. Brant's death was just the beginning of a far larger conspiracy, one that involved smuggling, corruption, and perhaps even treason. And now, with William Rudd sitting just within reach, it was only a matter of time before they unraveled the web. The investigation into the murder of Edward Brant had unearthed far more than anyone had anticipated. Mycroft's careful calculations, combined with Sherlock's razor-sharp intuition, had led them to the criminal underworld of East London, a place where secrets were guarded fiercely and danger lurked in every corner. With the mysterious cargo manifest and the shadowy figure of William Rudd looming ahead, it was clear that the Holmes brothers were on the brink of something far greater than just a murder mystery. The path ahead was fraught with risk, but Sherlock and Mycroft knew that, sooner or later, the truth would be revealed. And when it was, they would be ready. As they approached Rudd's table, the answers they had sought for so long were finally within their grasp. But so was the danger. The next steps of their investigation would prove to be more dangerous than they could ever imagine, for they were no longer simply chasing a criminal. They were on the trail of a conspiracy that threatened the very heart of London itself. Part 5. The Underworld's Grip. The pub's low hum of conversation continued as Sherlock and Mycroft approached the table where William Rudd sat, his eyes shifting with the occasional glance at the door. His weathered features, rough hands, and the menacing aura around him made it clear that he was not the type of man to be easily intimidated. But Sherlock Holmes was not easily deterred, and Mycroft's presence only added weight to their cause. Rudd noticed the brothers approaching, his lips twitching into a small, knowing smirk. He had no doubt about their identities, and the faint trace of recognition in his eyes confirmed it. Well, if it isn't the famous Holmes brothers, Rudd's voice rasped, the years of hard living evident in every syllable. What brings the two of you to my humble little corner of London? Last I heard, the Yard wasn't particularly fond of me. Sherlock's sharp gaze met Rudd's, his eyes assessing the man with the precision of a surgeon's scalpel. We're not here for idle chatter, Rudd. We're investigating a murder. Edward Brant. You know him, don't you? The name seemed to hit its mark. Rudd stiffened, his eyes narrowing in a way that suggested he was considering his next words carefully. Brant? That fool. He spat on the floor, his lips curling in disdain. He got himself tangled up with the wrong people. Always did, that one. Mycroft leaned forward, his voice calm but firm. We've traced a shipment of goods linked to Brant's murder. It came from the SS Orion, and you, William, have a direct connection to it. What were you involved in, and why was Brant so intent on uncovering your activities? Rudd's eyes flickered. For a moment, it seemed as if he might try to deny it, but then the weight of their investigation must have sunk in. His lips twitched again, this time more in amusement than in fear. You don't know half of it, do you? The SS Orion is a cover, a bloody good one, too. It brings in all sorts of cargo under the radar, things no one in their right mind should touch. But Brant, bless him, thought he could play the game without getting burned. He was looking for something big, something dangerous. Rudd leaned back in his chair, his eyes glinting with a mix of bitterness and resignation. Sherlock watched him intently. And what was that something, Rudd? What exactly did he discover? Rudd took a long swig from his mug, his fingers curling around the handle like a man holding on to the last vestiges of control. His gaze shifted to Mycroft briefly before returning to Sherlock. Brant was digging into something old. Very old. Smuggling rings, stolen artifacts, weapons shipments, things that trace all the way back to the Napoleonic Wars. The SS Orion was just a small part of it, but it was linked to something bigger. Something with ties to the government, even. And that's where it gets messy. Sherlock's mind raced as he processed the information. Ties to the government? This was never just about crime, then. What do you mean? Rudd leaned forward now, his tone dropping to a near whisper, as if the walls themselves might be listening. There are people in high places, gentlemen. People with money, power, and influence. They've been running a network of illegal deals, hidden in plain sight. Arms shipments to the colonies, stolen treasures, all sorts of things. The Orion was only one piece of the puzzle, but Brant, he had the wrong idea about it. He thought he could expose them. He was close. Too close, and that's why they took him out. Mycroft's voice was chilling as he spoke. You're suggesting that there's a conspiracy within the very corridors of power? That this smuggling operation has ties to government officials? Rudd nodded slowly, his face tightening with regret. I don't know the full picture, but I've seen enough to know that it reaches further than anyone realizes. They won't let it go. Too much is at stake. Sherlock's eyes glinted as a new theory began to form in his mind. So, Brant's death was a cover-up. He knew too much, and now someone is trying to eliminate all traces of what he found. But why kill a cabinet minister? Sherlock's voice turned sharper, as if he had just stumbled upon the missing link. The second victim, Sir Reginald Forsyth. Why him? Rudd's expression faltered for a moment before he forced a laugh. Ah, Forsyth. That's where it gets trickier. He wasn't just any politician. Forsyth was involved in foreign relations and trade agreements. He had access to the sort of information that could bring everything crashing down. He was a liability, and just like Brant, he got too close to the truth. Whoever's behind this needs to silence anyone who might know what's really going on. Sherlock stood in stunned silence for a moment. So, we have an illicit trade network, a conspiracy within the government, and now the deaths of 2 men who are about to expose it. This is much larger than we anticipated. Mycroft, ever the voice of reason, spoke next. We need to get to the root of this quickly. If the government is involved, we cannot afford to take this lightly. We'll need to gather more evidence, and we must proceed carefully. These men have powerful allies, and we cannot afford to make a wrong move. Rudd's lips curled into a grin that was as much warning as it was mockery. Good luck with that. The people behind this have eyes everywhere. And trust me, you don't want to find out how far their reach goes. Sherlock's gaze darkened, his voice firm and resolute. We'll take our chances, Rudd. But know this, we will expose the truth. You've already given us enough to go on. Rudd leaned back in his chair, his eyes narrowing, as though trying to weigh the danger of their words. I won't be around to see it, he muttered, almost to himself. But if you get too close, gentlemen, I hope you can swim. Part 6. Beneath the Surface. Leaving Rudd to his cryptic warning, Sherlock and Mycroft stepped out of the pub into the biting cold night air. The fog had thickened even further, and the city seemed to take on a more sinister tone under the cover of darkness. The weight of their conversation hung between them as they made their way down the street. Rudd is more than just a pawn in this game, Sherlock mused as they walked. He's a man who knows the stakes, and he's not afraid of the danger. Mycroft's eyes were narrowed in thought. The question is, what does he really know? His tale seems to align with the facts we've uncovered, but I'm not convinced he's telling us everything. He's still holding something back. Sherlock stopped in his tracks, turning toward his brother. But the most important piece of this puzzle, what Brant uncovered, is still missing. We have the connection to the SS Orion, the smuggling ring, and even the involvement of high-ranking government officials. But we don't know what Brant was truly after. Mycroft nodded slowly. And until we find that, we're only chasing shadows. We need to dig deeper into both the SS Orion's records and the network of officials Rudd mentioned. And then we'll see how far this rabbit hole really goes. As they continued through the fog-choked streets, it became apparent that their journey was far from over. The web of conspiracy was growing thicker by the moment, and with each new revelation, the stakes only grew higher. The murder of Brant had been the first spark in a firestorm that threatened to consume everything in its path. And now, with Forsyth's death, the situation had escalated to a level no one could have foreseen. But Sherlock and Mycroft were undeterred. They had the tools to uncover the truth, and they would not stop until they had it, no matter where the evidence led. As the Holmes brothers ventured deeper into the heart of this conspiracy, the investigation took on a darker tone. The shadows of London seemed to close in around them, and each step forward brought them closer to a danger they had yet to fully comprehend. The pieces of the puzzle were coming together, but the picture remained unclear. What they knew for certain was that the game they were playing was far more perilous than they had ever imagined. And as the fog rolled in and the night deepened, it became clear that the worst was yet to come. Part 7. The Tangled Web. As Sherlock and Mycroft made their way toward their next lead, a quiet tension filled the air between them. They had just finished speaking with William Rudd, and the elusive truth about Brant's murder and the conspiracy surrounding it was beginning to materialize, though in fragments, like a broken mirror. The deeper they dug, the more dangerous it seemed. But for Sherlock, the thrill of the chase was a constant companion, and nothing short of the truth would quench his relentless curiosity. The two brothers arrived at Scotland Yard shortly after midnight, where Inspector Lestrade was awaiting them in his small, dimly lit office. His disheveled appearance and weary eyes suggested that the investigation had taken its toll on him, yet there was a glimmer of something like hope in his gaze when he saw Sherlock enter. I trust your meeting with Rudd was informative, Lestrade said, glancing at Mycroft before returning his focus to Sherlock. Sherlock raised an eyebrow. He told us about the SS Orion and its connection to the smuggling ring, but he's hardly the most forthcoming of sources. Lestrade grunted. No surprise there. That man's always been a slippery one. But we've been doing our best to follow up on any evidence we've found. I've got a list of names, officials, businessmen, and some dock workers who may be involved. But you're going to need something stronger than just a list to break this case wide open. Sherlock studied the paper Lestrade handed him. A long list of individuals with connections to the SS Orion, both legitimate and otherwise. Several names stood out to him. High-ranking politicians, a few aristocrats, and businessmen with vested interests in the colonies. But it was the name at the very top of the list that caught Sherlock's eye. Alastair Whitmore. Whitmore? Sherlock murmured under his breath, his fingers tracing the name. He's been connected to several illegal trade operations in the past, though his ties were always difficult to prove. Mycroft, who had been silently observing, leaned over Sherlock's shoulder and studied the paper. Alastair Whitmore's involvement would explain a great deal. He's been a shadowy figure in political circles for years, and I suspect his dealings are not as innocent as they appear. Sherlock stood up, folding the paper with quick precision. We need to find Whitmore immediately. He may hold the key to understanding the full scope of this conspiracy. Lestrade nodded, his face darkening with the gravity of the situation. I've already put a team on it, but Whitmore's not exactly an easy man to track. He's good at covering his tracks, and he's got friends in very high places. Mycroft's gaze darkened. Then it's a good thing we have our own ways of finding the truth. The hours that followed were a blur of activity. Sherlock and Mycroft reviewed every scrap of information they could find on Whitmore, both through official channels and through their own discreet inquiries. It quickly became clear that Whitmore was not just an opportunistic businessman. He was a key player in a web of corruption that stretched all the way to the heart of government. As Sherlock sat by the window, his mind working through the details of the case, Mycroft stood at his side, his posture as rigid as always. I've spoken with some of my contacts, Mycroft said quietly, his voice carrying an air of reluctant admission. Whitmore has connections with powerful people who would not hesitate to eliminate anyone who poses a threat to their interests. Sherlock's eyes flickered with understanding. Which is why Brant and Forsyth had to be silenced. But it's not just about them. Whitmore's dealings extend far beyond their deaths. This is about power, about control. Mycroft nodded, and it's about making sure no one ever gets close to the truth. But the fact that you've managed to trace it this far means they're running out of time. Lestrade entered the room, his face grim. Sherlock, Mycroft, there's been another killing. Sherlock's heart quickened. Who? The fourth victim, Lestrade said, his voice tight with the weight of the words. James Calloway, a government official with ties to the colonies. We found him in an alley just off the Thames. Same as the others. No sign of struggle, but he had information on Whitmore. He was digging into the illegal trade routes, and now he's dead. Sherlock's mind raced as he processed the new development. This is escalating faster than I anticipated. Whitmore is making sure anyone who poses a threat is eliminated. But why kill Calloway? He was just starting to connect the dots between the illegal shipments and the politicians. Mycroft's voice cut through Sherlock's musings. Because Calloway was a threat, he had information that could have exposed everything. Sherlock's brow furrowed. It seems Whitmore is going to great lengths to ensure his secret remains hidden. But there's something else going on here. Something deeper. We need to understand Whitmore's endgame. What is he trying to protect? What's so important that people are dying for it? Lestrade's face hardened. We don't have the luxury of time, Sherlock. These killings are happening faster than we can track them. At this rate, we're going to lose our chance to catch the killer. Sherlock stood up abruptly, a sudden clarity in his eyes. We can't afford to chase shadows anymore. Whitmore is too careful, too well protected. But there's one thing he doesn't expect us to do. Mycroft raised an eyebrow. What's that? Sherlock's lips curled into a small smile. We're going to turn the tables. We'll create a trap, one that Whitmore won't be able to resist. Part 8. The trap is set. Sherlock, Mycroft, and Lestrade spent the following hours carefully constructing a plan. The key, Sherlock realized, was to use Whitmore's own arrogance and his overconfidence against him. After all, Whitmore believed himself untouchable. He had the connections, the wealth, and the influence to remain in the shadows. Until now. Sherlock had a plan that would lure Whitmore into the open. They would use a piece of misinformation to spark his interest. An old, supposedly missing shipment of rare artifacts that would be of interest to the high-ranking officials involved in the smuggling ring. But they needed someone to play the role of the decoy. Someone who could feign ignorance while secretly feeding information to Sherlock. And that someone was none other than Inspector Lestrade himself. Lestrade was not entirely thrilled with the idea, but he understood the importance of the mission. After all, it was the only way to catch Whitmore before he could claim another victim. With the plan in motion, Sherlock sent a coded message to his network of informants, requesting updates on Whitmore's whereabouts. Meanwhile, Mycroft used his government connections to place pressure on certain individuals in Whitmore's inner circle. The Holmes brothers were accustomed to operating in the shadows, and they knew just how to manipulate the system to their advantage. As the hours passed, the pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place. Sherlock felt a rush of satisfaction. This was what he lived for. The challenge of outsmarting the criminals, of peeling back the layers of deception and uncovering the truth hidden beneath. The night before their plan would come to fruition, Sherlock stood by the window once again, staring out at the city. "You've been unusually quiet tonight," Mycroft remarked from across the room. "What's on your mind?" Sherlock did not answer immediately. Instead, he continued to gaze out into the night, as if searching for something in the depths of the fog. Finally, he spoke, his voice softer than usual. "It's not just about solving the case, Mycroft. It's about understanding why people do the things they do. The greed, the ambition, it's what drives men like Whitmore to commit these horrible acts. But in the end, they always think they're untouchable. That's what they never understand." Mycroft regarded his brother with a quiet, knowing expression. "And you intend to prove that they're wrong." Sherlock turned to face him, his eyes gleaming with an almost predatory focus. "Exactly." As the clock ticked toward midnight, the trap was set, and tomorrow they would catch the man behind the deaths, once and for all. Part 9. The Gathering Storm. The night was thick with mist as Sherlock, Mycroft, and Inspector Lestrade huddled in the shadows of a quiet alley near the docks. The plan had been set in motion, and now it was a waiting game. The city around them seemed to hold its breath, as if even the fog was aware of the impending danger. Sherlock had chosen this spot carefully, far enough from the prying eyes of Whitmore's network, but close enough to the warehouses where the clandestine trade was taking place. The bait was set. Inspector Lestrade, posing as a low-level informant with knowledge of the missing artifacts, would be the key to drawing Whitmore's men out into the open. Sherlock had carefully crafted a fake document, supposedly from a trusted source, claiming that the artifacts would be shipped through the very docks where they now stood. The trap would soon be sprung, but as Sherlock glanced at his watch, his mind raced. There were so many variables to account for. Too many to guarantee a clean capture. Whitmore, despite his arrogance, was no fool. He had a network of loyalists who would be on high alert. If Sherlock's theory was correct, Whitmore would not come himself. He would send his most trusted lieutenants to handle the matter. These men would be the ones to fall into their trap. Mycroft, as always, was calm, though his gaze occasionally flickered to the shadows where Lestrade waited. The fog seemed to thicken around them, swallowing the sounds of the city and distorting the shapes of the buildings across the street. "You're quiet tonight, Sherlock," Mycroft said in his measured tone, the weight of his words more an observation than a question. Sherlock, still scanning the area, answered absently. "I'm thinking about Whitmore's next move. He's desperate, Mycroft. We've cornered him, and he knows it. His men will be out in force soon, and we need to be prepared." Lestrade, who had been standing silently a few feet away, stepped forward. "Sherlock, you sure about this?" "I don't relish the thought of going out there as bait, but I understand the importance of it." Sherlock gave him a reassuring glance. "You've been more than capable in the past, Lestrade. Trust me, this will work. We just need to remain focused and stay alert." The words were still hanging in the air when a muffled sound reached Sherlock's ears, a distant echo of footsteps against the cobblestones. The tension in the alley grew as the sound grew louder, then paused. Sherlock's heart quickened. It was time. He gave a brief nod to Mycroft, and they moved swiftly, positioning themselves in the shadows, their eyes fixed on the scene unfolding ahead. Lestrade took up his place, his posture deliberately casual, but his sharp eyes scanning the area for any signs of movement. Minutes stretched like hours. The fog swirled, casting an eerie pallor over the alley. Then, as if on cue, two figures appeared at the edge of the fog. They were cloaked in dark coats, their faces obscured by the hoods of their garments. As they approached Lestrade, Sherlock could see the faint glint of metal in their hands, guns concealed but ready. Lestrade straightened, adopting the air of a man who was only half aware of the gravity of his situation. He held up a small, sealed envelope, carefully designed to look official, though it contained only false information. "You the men from Whitmore?" he called in a low voice, his tone laced with a thin veil of mockery. One of the figures stopped just a few feet away, his eyes narrowing as he assessed Lestrade. "You've got the goods?" he asked, his voice a low growl. Lestrade nodded slowly, passing the envelope to the man. "The shipment's coming through tonight, as promised. Just need the right hands to take care of it." The man's eyes flicked to his companion, who gave a subtle nod. "You'll get your reward when the job's done," the man said, his voice carrying a threat that was unmistakable. Sherlock tensed as the man reached into his coat. It was now or never. "Lestrade, get ready," Sherlock whispered to his brother. At that moment, Sherlock stepped forward, his movements swift and sure. "Not so fast," he called out, his voice steady and commanding. The two men froze, their eyes darting in Sherlock's direction. The fog parted just enough to reveal his figure, sharp and unmistakable even in the dim light. "Holmes," one of the men hissed, recognizing the detective immediately. "You've been a thorn in our side for far too long." Sherlock smiled coldly. "You've underestimated me, and your employer, Whitmore, has made a grave mistake by trying to cover his tracks in such an obvious way." Lestrade, now fully alert, stepped back slowly, positioning himself at the ready. The tension in the air was palpable, the kind of stillness that preceded an inevitable explosion. The second man, the one who had been silent until now, moved with sudden, lethal speed, drawing his weapon from beneath his coat. But Sherlock was quicker. In one smooth motion, he lunged forward, knocking the gun from the man's hand and sending it skittering across the cobblestones. Before the man could react, Sherlock had him in a vice-like grip, twisting his arm behind his back. The first man, now visibly panicked, reached for his own weapon, but Mycroft stepped out from the shadows, his voice cold and calculated. "Drop it, or we'll be forced to take action." The man hesitated, his eyes darting between the Holmes brothers. Then, with a low curse, he dropped his weapon to the ground. Lestrade wasted no time. "You two are under arrest for the murders of William Rudd, Samuel Forsyth, James Calloway, and others. You're going to answer for everything." The two men exchanged desperate glances, but it was too late. Sherlock had anticipated their every move, and now they were trapped. Sherlock stepped forward, his eyes cold as he looked down at the men. "I suggest you start talking. We know about the shipment. We know about the smuggling ring. And we know your employer, Whitmore. It's only a matter of time before we have all the evidence we need to bring him down." The first man swallowed hard, his face pale beneath his hood. "You think you're going to take down Whitmore? You're nothing. He's untouchable." Sherlock's smile was sharp and triumphant. "No, you're the ones who are untouchable, but not for much longer." Part 10. The Breaking Point. As Sherlock and Mycroft escorted the two men to Scotland Yard, the storm clouds overhead seemed to mirror the dark mood hanging over the city. The trap had worked, but there was still one final piece of the puzzle left to uncover. Whitmore? Sherlock's mind raced as he reviewed the information they had gathered over the past few days. The men they had arrested were just pawns in Whitmore's grand scheme, and now it was time to bring the true mastermind to justice. Inside Scotland Yard, Lestrade wasted no time in interrogating the prisoners. Sherlock and Mycroft remained in the observation room, their eyes fixed on the men, who were now being held in separate cells. "I want to know everything," Lestrade said, his gruff. "You're both involved in more than just the murders. You've been part of a larger operation, And it's not just about smuggling. There's something bigger at play here. The first man, who had been silent throughout most of the arrest, finally spoke. "You think you've got us? You think we'll talk? Whitmore won't let this go. You'll never get him." Sherlock leaned closer to Mycroft, his voice a low whisper. "He's right about one thing. Whitmore won't let this go. We need to move quickly." Mycroft nodded, his face grim. "We've already started the process. We'll have the authorities search every one of Whitmore's properties. He won't escape this time." But Sherlock wasn't so sure. Whitmore had been too careful, too elusive. The trail was growing cold, and even with all their resources, it was becoming clear that catching him would not be as simple as it seemed. "Mycroft," Sherlock said, his tone sharp. "We need to set a trap. Something Whitmore won't be able to resist. We'll make him come to us." Part 11. The Final Gambit. As the hours ticked by, the Holmes brothers and Lestrade prepared for the final phase of their plan. The pieces were falling into place, but the stakes had never been higher. Whitmore was on the verge of being exposed, and he would do whatever it took to silence those who stood in his way. Sherlock had a plan. It was risky, but it was the only way to catch Whitmore before he could disappear into the shadows once again. They would use the very system he had manipulated for so long against him. The stage was set. Part 12. The Final Trap. The fog rolled back in thicker than before, shrouding the docks in a blanket of gray. The Thames River flowed sluggishly beneath the wharves, its dark surface barely disturbed by the occasional ripple from a passing boat. It was a scene that seemed too calm, too quiet, for the events that were about to unfold. Sherlock stood at the edge of the warehouse, peering through the slats of the wooden boards that formed its crumbling facade. Mycroft and Lestrade were positioned in different spots along the perimeter of the area, with an army of constables waiting for the signal to close in. The last of Whitmore's men had been captured and brought in for questioning, but the final piece remained: Whitmore himself. "I can't say I'm overly confident, Sherlock," Lestrade muttered, his voice cutting through the stillness. "Whitmore has his fingers in too many pies. He won't just walk in here without suspecting something's up." Sherlock turned his eyes on the inspector, his expression a mixture of cold calculation and thin amusement. "He has no choice, Lestrade. His entire network is crumbling. He believes that tonight's shipment is critical. The lure of escaping his impending downfall will drive him here. His greed will be his undoing." "Hope you're right," Lestrade replied. He tugged his coat tighter around his frame, the chill of the night creeping through. Mycroft, always the more restrained of the two brothers, stepped forward from the shadows. "Sherlock, if you are wrong, Whitmore will slip through our fingers once again. We cannot afford another mistake." Sherlock allowed a thin smile to cross his lips. "I'm not wrong, Mycroft. Whitmore's ego is his greatest weakness. He thinks he's too clever for anyone to catch, but he's not accounting for the one thing I understand better than anyone else: human nature." Mycroft's expression softened, but he said nothing further. Sherlock's confidence was undeniable, and though he was rarely willing to admit it, Mycroft was beginning to trust his brother's methods. Tonight, it seemed, was the endgame. They didn't have to wait long. As the minutes dragged on, the sound of a car engine hummed faintly in the distance. Sherlock's eyes darted toward the docks, where the sound grew louder, closer. It was a black automobile, unmistakably the type that Whitmore favored when conducting business in the shadows. The car slowed, then stopped at the entrance of the old warehouse. A figure emerged, cloaked in dark clothing, a figure whose outline was immediately familiar. "Whitmore," Sherlock murmured. Lestrade stepped closer to Sherlock. "Do we move now?" Sherlock shook his head, holding up a hand to silence him. "Patience, Lestrade. He must come inside first. Only then will we have him." Whitmore's eyes scanned the perimeter with cautious vigilance, but he didn't seem to notice the officer standing just out of view. The man was a master of keeping his cool in dangerous situations, but tonight he was walking directly into a trap. He had no idea that his every move was being watched. As he made his way toward the warehouse, his shoes clicking against the cobblestones, Sherlock's mind raced. There were so many variables to consider, so many places where this plan could go awry. But everything hinged on one thing: Whitmore's belief that he was untouchable. And that arrogance, Sherlock knew, was his fatal flaw. Once inside, Whitmore took a moment to adjust to the darkness of the warehouse. The air was thick with dust, and the stale smell of mildew lingered in the corners. He walked further in, his steps echoing in the cavernous space. Suddenly, the lights flickered on, illuminating the full scope of the warehouse. Whitmore froze, his gaze darting around as if trying to decipher what was happening. The figure who appeared before him, stepping out from the shadows, was the last person he had expected to see. "Sherlock Holmes," Whitmore hissed, a sneer curling on his lips. "I should have known you'd be behind this. How did you find me?" Sherlock, standing in the middle of the room, raised an eyebrow. "You always make the same mistake, Whitmore. You underestimate me." Behind Sherlock, the sound of footsteps signaled Mycroft and Lestrade's arrival, along with a dozen constables, who swiftly surrounded the criminal. Whitmore's face twisted with fury as he realized he had walked directly into a well-laid trap. "Did you think you could get away with murder? Smuggling? Your entire network is unraveling, and you've been foolish enough to think you were invincible," Sherlock continued, his tone cold and methodical. Whitmore took a step forward, his eyes blazing with anger. "You think you've won, Holmes? This is just the beginning. Do you honestly believe the government will let you ruin everything I've worked for? I'm untouchable. You'll never bring me down." At that, Sherlock's eyes narrowed. "You were never untouchable, Whitmore. Your ambition blinded you to the fact that your empire was built on the backs of the dead, and now it will all come crashing down. There's no one left who can protect you." Lestrade stepped forward, his hand poised to place the cuffs around Whitmore's wrists. "You're under arrest for the murder of several individuals, including Samuel Forsyth, William Rudd, and James Calloway, and for your role in an illegal smuggling ring operating through the docks of London." Whitmore's face twisted with rage as he was taken into custody, but he did not resist. The arrogant smirk never left his lips. Part 13. The Puzzle Unravels. The following days were a whirlwind of interrogations, court appearances, and the processing of evidence. Sherlock, ever the perfectionist, had already begun to review the details of the case, double-checking every step of the investigation to ensure that no stone was left unturned. Lestrade, though visibly exhausted, couldn't help but admire the methodical nature with which Sherlock had pieced together the web of lies and deceit that had allowed Whitmore to operate for so long without detection. "This is your triumph, Sherlock," Lestrade said one morning as he walked with Sherlock through the corridors of Scotland Yard. "I've never seen a case solved with such precision. You've taken down one of the most dangerous men in London." Sherlock nodded thoughtfully, but his eyes were distant. "The case is not yet closed, Lestrade. There are still questions to answer. What we know about Whitmore's smuggling ring is only the tip of the iceberg. We must uncover the full extent of his operation and the people who were involved in it." Mycroft, as always, was less impressed by the spectacle of the arrest. He was more concerned with the long-term implications for the government. Whitmore's reach extended far beyond the docks. The damage he caused, politically, financially, it's going to take years to fully address. The ramifications of his actions are just beginning to surface. Sherlock glanced at his brother, recognizing the weight of the situation. "I agree, Mycroft, but for now, we've won. We've stopped the murders, and we've exposed the criminal network he built. That's something." Back at Baker Street, Sherlock sat in his usual chair, eyes narrowed as he sifted through the letters that had piled up on the table. Each one contained praise from various parties, government officials, police, even some of the families of the victims. Yet despite the accolades, Sherlock couldn't shake the feeling that something was still missing. "Another case solved, but the puzzle never truly feels complete," he murmured to himself. Watson, who had been reading by the fire, raised an eyebrow. "Always the perfectionist, aren't you, Holmes?" Sherlock smiled faintly. A detective is never satisfied with anything less than absolute clarity. And in this case, there are still pieces of the puzzle that haven't fallen into place. Watson put down his book. His curiosity piqued. "What do you mean?" Sherlock paused, tapping his fingers on the armrest. Whitmore was not working alone. There are others involved in this scheme, higher up the chain. It's only a matter of time before they reveal themselves. Another mystery? Watson asked, an amused smile tugging at his lips. Sherlock's eyes gleamed with intensity. Indeed, another mystery. Part 14, the final revelation. The days turned into weeks, and though Whitmore's arrest had been a triumph for Sherlock, the truth was that there was still much to be uncovered. The investigation had only peeled back the surface of a much larger conspiracy. One morning, while Sherlock was sifting through his notes, a sudden knock on the door interrupted his thoughts. "Come in," he called, looking up. The door opened and Inspector Lestrade entered, his face somber. "Sherlock, we've got a problem." "Go on," Sherlock said, setting his papers aside. "We've received word that several high-ranking government officials were involved with Whitmore," Lestrade continued. "He wasn't just running a smuggling operation, he was selling out national secrets. The real danger lies in what he was supplying to foreign powers." Sherlock stood abruptly, his thoughts racing. I should have known. There were too many moving parts, too many people who could gain from his downfall. But now we've entered a new game. Lestrade nodded. This is bigger than we thought. And I need you, Sherlock. Mycroft is pulling every string he can, but we need to act quickly. Sherlock turned back to his desk, his mind already working. Then let's begin, Lestrade. The final pieces are about to fall into place. Part 15, the web expands. Sherlock Holmes sat at the center of his study, his fingers lightly tapping the edge of his desk. A pile of papers sat before him, each one containing a fragment of a larger mystery. The news Lestrade had delivered to him earlier that day had shaken him, though not in the way one might expect. The complexity of Whitmore's smuggling ring, the scale of it, was far greater than even Sherlock had anticipated. The investigation had unraveled a trail of corruption that stretched through London's elite, reaching its tendrils into government ministries and foreign embassies. The realization that Whitmore had been trading national secrets, weapon blueprints, and sensitive information to the highest bidder left Sherlock feeling an uncomfortable sense of urgency. He turned his chair toward the window, peering out into the foggy streets, trying to discern where the next step of the investigation would take him. Lestrade had left him with one essential piece of information: an anonymous tip-off that a secret meeting was taking place that night between the remaining members of Whitmore's operation. It was clear that these individuals believed their criminal enterprise was far from over, despite Whitmore's downfall. If Sherlock could uncover their identities, it would expose the last and most dangerous facet of Whitmore's web. At that moment, there was a soft knock on the door. "Enter," Sherlock called, not bothering to look away from the window. The door creaked open, and Dr. Watson stepped in, his familiar presence offering a sense of comfort in the midst of the chaos. He held up a freshly arrived letter, the seal unmistakable. "Another letter from Mycroft, no doubt," Watson remarked, a smile tugging at the corner of his lips. He had long since become accustomed to the cryptic, often incomprehensible communications from Sherlock's older brother, who had a way of overcomplicating the simplest of messages. Sherlock didn't respond immediately. His mind was far from the letter. He had already formulated the plan that would lead him to the heart of the conspiracy. "Watson, we have work to do." The doctor raised an eyebrow. "Is it about Whitmore's associates? Or something more?" Sherlock nodded, finally turning his attention to Watson. "Yes, Whitmore's network is far from broken. There are still players who haven't yet been brought to light, and they will do whatever they can to keep their operations hidden." Watson placed the letter on the table, giving Sherlock his full attention. "So what's the next move?" Sherlock stood and crossed to the fireplace, where he paused for a moment, adjusting the small trinkets that sat atop the mantel. His eyes flicked back to Watson. "Lestrade received a tip. A meeting is planned for tonight at a warehouse on the outskirts of town. Whitmore's partners will likely gather there to consolidate power, perhaps to continue their trade or plan their next moves." Watson's face tightened. "And you intend to interrupt it?" "Exactly," Sherlock said, his lips curling into a faint, almost imperceptible smile. "I don't believe they'll expect us. It's the perfect opportunity to finally dismantle the operation. Mycroft is already attempting to manage the government angle, but this is a matter of bringing the remaining criminals to justice." That evening, the fog descended once more as Sherlock, Watson, and Lestrade made their way toward the docks. The cold air stung their faces, but there was no time for such discomfort. Sherlock's mind was laser-focused on the task ahead. As they neared the warehouse, Sherlock motioned for them to halt. He turned to Lestrade, his tone hushed but firm. "You and your men will approach from the rear. I'll take the front. If things go awry, we must act swiftly." Lestrade nodded. "Understood, Holmes. But don't underestimate these men. They've managed to evade us for this long. We can't afford to take any chances." Sherlock's expression became even more serious. "I am well aware of the risks, Lestrade, but we are not here for a confrontation. We are here to dismantle their network. Let them make the first move." Watson, who had been silent up to that point, gave a quiet sigh. "And what if that move puts us at risk?" Sherlock met Watson's gaze. "Then we will respond in kind." With a final glance at each other, the trio moved into position. The warehouse loomed ahead, a sprawling structure of stone and wood that seemed to belong more to the past than to the present. It had been years since it had seen any legitimate use, but tonight it was to be the center of a dangerous meeting. Sherlock led the way, slipping inside through a narrow, rusted door that creaked loudly on its hinges. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of oil and decay. The dim light cast long shadows, and Sherlock's eyes narrowed as he took in the details. Crates stacked haphazardly, broken windows, and the unmistakable hum of activity in the far corner. He motioned for Watson and Lestrade to follow him, but they remained still, waiting for his signal. Sherlock's eyes darted about the room, taking in every movement, every sound. His acute awareness told him that they were not alone. In the distance, he saw figures, shadows, flickering against the walls. These were the men who had helped build Whitmore's empire. They were scattered across the warehouse, speaking in low tones, their faces obscured in the half-light. Then, the moment Sherlock had been waiting for arrived. A man stepped into the center of the room, his features obscured by a hooded cloak. It was clear from the man's posture, however, that he was a leader, his every movement calculated, his presence commanding attention. The others fell silent as he approached a makeshift podium in the center of the warehouse. Sherlock signaled to Lestrade, and the inspector gestured to his men. Within seconds, the room erupted into action. Officers flooded the warehouse, cornering the remaining criminals and effectively ending the meeting before it could even begin. Sherlock made his way toward the leader, who seemed unfazed by the sudden turn of events. "It seems you've underestimated the reach of the law," Sherlock said coolly. His gaze locked onto the cloaked figure. The man tilted his head, a small smirk forming beneath his hood. "You think you've won, Holmes? This is far from over. Whitmore was only a cog in a much larger machine. There are others waiting, others who will finish what he started." Sherlock's expression grew colder. "And you think they will succeed? That they can operate without consequences? You've miscalculated." The man chuckled darkly. "You have no idea what you're dealing with, Holmes. The game has only just begun." With those final words, the man was subdued, and the remaining members of the smuggling ring were arrested. But Sherlock knew that what this figure had said was no mere boast. The web of corruption was far from untangled, and more players, more dangerous players, remained hidden in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to strike. Part 16. The Darker Truth. The following day, Sherlock found himself once again in his study, poring over the letters and reports that had accumulated during the investigation. The sense of accomplishment he had felt earlier had begun to ebb, replaced by the nagging suspicion that they were missing something critical. Watson, noticing the change in Sherlock's demeanor, stepped into the room. "Something's bothering you, isn't it?" Sherlock didn't look up, his focus still on the papers. "It's not over, Watson. I've dealt with enough criminals in my time to know that when you capture one, another rises in its place." "What are you saying?" Watson asked, stepping closer. Sherlock's fingers ran through his hair as he considered his next words carefully. "The man we apprehended last night, the leader of the smuggling ring, he wasn't Whitmore's right-hand man. He was something far worse, a puppet master, and his words." Sherlock trailed off, as if the implication of what had been said had only just settled into his mind. Watson frowned. "So there's more to this than we know." Sherlock nodded, his gaze sharp as he finally looked up at Watson. Yes, the game is far from over, and it's a game I intend to win. As Sherlock continued his investigation into the depths of the conspiracy, one thing became increasingly clear. Whitmore's operation had only been the beginning. The true danger lay in what remained hidden, behind the shadows of power, influence, and corruption. The deeper Sherlock dug, the more he realized that the network he had uncovered was only one part of a far more dangerous and complex machine, and in the coming days, the truth would begin to unravel, piece by piece, until the final confrontation came into view. Part 17. Shadows behind the curtain. The investigation had reached a boiling point. What had initially seemed like a localized conspiracy centered around the docks and Whitmore's smuggling ring had grown into something far more insidious. The whispers Sherlock had overheard from the apprehended criminals in the warehouse haunted him. They spoke of a larger machine, and now Sherlock found himself consumed with unraveling this phrase. He sat in his study, the clutter of papers scattered across the table, his mind racing through every possibility. He had already alerted Lestrade and his team to a second group of conspirators who operated within the city's underbelly. Yet, even with all the intelligence and resources available to him, Sherlock felt a gnawing sense of urgency, that there was still something lurking just beyond the veil of the investigation. The most significant lead lay in the mysterious cloaked figure who had confronted Sherlock in the warehouse. The man's words still echoed in his mind. "You think you've won? There are others waiting to finish what Whitmore started." It wasn't just an empty threat. There was truth in them. The operation that Sherlock had only partially dismantled was already in the process of reassembling itself, ready to strike again. Sherlock turned toward Watson, who was reading over a pile of reports from Scotland Yard. Watson, ever the perceptive companion, seemed to sense that something was different in Sherlock's demeanor. "You've been quiet today," Watson said, his voice gentle but probing. "What's on your mind?" Sherlock's sharp eyes focused on Watson, narrowing slightly as he turned over the latest information in his mind. "The criminals we arrested last night, they weren't just random gangsters. They were part of something far larger, something that goes far beyond Whitmore. Whitmore was simply a front, an intermediary. These men, they were the real power behind the operation." Watson's brow furrowed. "And you think they were just the beginning?" Sherlock stood, pacing back and forth in his study. His voice grew more intense with each word. Precisely. This was a network that extended to the highest echelons of society, to government ministers, powerful industrialists, and foreign agents. If what the leader said in the warehouse is true, there is a much larger game being played. "But we've already arrested several key players," Watson said, trying to bring the situation into focus. "Isn't that enough?" Sherlock paused, his gaze fixed on the fireplace. The embers flickered with a dull light, casting eerie shadows across the room. "No, Watson. The bigger fish are still out there. And now, it seems, they've made their move." The door to the study creaked open, and Lestrade entered with his usual air of tension and determination. He looked at Sherlock and Watson with a grim expression. "You were right to be concerned, Holmes," Lestrade said. "I've just received word that another government official, a high-ranking cabinet minister, has gone missing. It's eerily similar to the disappearance of the first victim, before we discovered his body near the Thames." Sherlock's eyes narrowed. What's the connection between this cabinet minister and Whitmore? "That's what we don't know," Lestrade admitted. But the man was involved in several arms deals, and his influence in certain foreign negotiations could have made him a prime target for anyone wanting to manipulate those deals. Sherlock immediately moved to his desk and grabbed his coat. "We need to find him before it's too late. I'll need all your men to scour the areas near Westminster and keep an eye out for anyone who might be trying to flee the country. We can't afford to let this go any further." Lestrade nodded and immediately took his leave, heading back to Scotland Yard to mobilize the necessary forces. Watson remained by Sherlock's side, watching him intently. The familiar sense of dread began to settle between them. This was no longer just a matter of solving a series of murders. It was a race against time to prevent a conspiracy that could reshape the political landscape of the entire country. The next several hours were a blur of activity. Sherlock, Watson, and a select team from Scotland Yard scoured the streets around Westminster, investigating every lead they could find. Their efforts were futile at first, as the minister's movements seemed well guarded, with none of the usual suspects emerging in the wake of the cabinet minister's disappearance. It wasn't until late in the evening, as the streets began to clear, that Sherlock received word from one of Lestrade's officers. A tip had come in from an informant who claimed to have seen a car that had been parked near the missing minister's estate, a car with diplomatic plates. Sherlock immediately knew that they were dealing with someone far more dangerous than petty criminals. "We've caught a break, Watson," Sherlock said as he grabbed his hat. "A diplomatic vehicle is involved. This could very well be the last piece of the puzzle." They rushed toward the estate, their footsteps echoing in the empty streets. Sherlock's mind worked furiously as they neared the area. It was no coincidence that the disappearance of a prominent figure had coincided with the deeper exposure of Whitmore's network. It seemed likely that whoever was behind this wasn't just interested in profit, they were interested in power. As they arrived at the estate, Sherlock paused at the gate, surveying the scene with careful precision. He was looking for something, anything, that would tell him where the missing minister had been taken. The gate was open slightly, and Sherlock moved forward cautiously. Watson, always by his side, remained quiet, knowing better than to interrupt Sherlock's train of thought. They made their way through the grounds, moving as stealthily as possible. Sherlock approached a small outbuilding, where he could see the faint outline of movement through the partially drawn blinds. His instincts told him that this was the place they had been searching for. Without hesitation, Sherlock motioned for Watson to stay behind and approach the door. His fingers danced across the lock, and with a soft click, the door opened. Inside, the scene was precisely what Sherlock had feared. The cabinet minister was unconscious, tied to a chair. Standing around him were several men, dressed in dark suits, their faces hidden behind masks. Sherlock's breath caught in his chest as he recognized one of them, the cloaked figure from the warehouse. Before Sherlock could make his presence known, the men turned in unison, as if they had been expecting him. One of them raised a hand, signaling for the others to remain still. The cloaked figure spoke, his voice cold and commanding. "I knew you would come, Sherlock Holmes," he said, "but you are too late. The game has already been won." Part 18, the final confrontation. Sherlock's mind raced, but his voice remained steady. "It's not over. You underestimate the power of justice." The cloaked figure chuckled darkly. "Do you still believe that, Holmes? That you can stop what's already been set in motion?" Sherlock's eyes flicked to the minister, still unconscious. He could see the faintest trace of blood trickling down from his temple. They had been torturing him, trying to extract information. But that wasn't the point anymore. Sherlock now understood the true magnitude of the situation. These men, these powerful conspirators, had been playing a much deeper game than he had imagined. They weren't simply motivated by money. They sought to dismantle the government itself. "You can't win," Sherlock said firmly. "You may have the advantage for now, but you won't get away with this." The cloaked figure's smirk grew wider. "You're in no position to make threats, Holmes. You've walked right into our trap." Sherlock looked at Watson, who stood silently, waiting for the right moment to strike. Without warning, Sherlock lunged forward, disarming one of the men closest to him. He grabbed the man by the collar and twisted, throwing him aside as his fist connected with the next assailant. In the chaos that ensued, Sherlock's mind worked faster than his movements. He could already see how the confrontation would play out. The cloaked figure would try to escape, but Sherlock had anticipated that. Watson would help subdue the remaining men, and the cabinet minister would be rescued. It didn't take long for the final piece to fall into place. In a swift motion, Sherlock grabbed the cloaked figure, pulling him to the ground. The mask was ripped away, revealing the face of a man Sherlock had seen only once before, a high-ranking government official with ties to foreign powers. "You," Sherlock hissed, fury and disbelief mixing in his tone. "You were the one pulling the strings all along." The man's eyes filled with cold malice. "Yes, Holmes. I was always one step ahead, but it seems your time has run out." With that, he reached for a hidden weapon, but Sherlock was faster. In a flash, the man was disarmed, restrained, and arrested. The rest of the conspiracy had been exposed. It was over. The news of the arrest spread quickly, and within days, the full extent of the conspiracy was revealed. Whitmore's smuggling ring had been merely the beginning. The true masterminds were the people in power, individuals whose influence had reached the highest levels of government, foreign relations, and industry. Sherlock Holmes had once again prevented disaster, but the victory felt hollow. He knew that power, once exposed, often had a way of returning in a different form. The game, as the cloaked figure had said, was not over, but for now, justice had been served. Part 19, The Web of Power. The news of the conspiracy's unraveling sent shockwaves through London, but Sherlock Holmes found little satisfaction in the momentary triumph. The arrest of the cloaked figure, along with several high-ranking officials involved in the illicit dealings, had shaken the very foundation of the government. Yet, even in the aftermath of the case, Sherlock could not shake the feeling that there were still pieces missing, dark shadows lingering at the edges of the investigation. It wasn't over. As the days passed, the city was alive with speculation. Parliament was thrown into chaos, and the public's trust in the government was shattered. Rumors circulated about the extent of the conspirators' network. It was clear now that this had been no ordinary political scandal. There were deep-rooted ties to international arms deals, shadow organizations, and a plan that stretched across continents. Sherlock sat in his study, poring over the documents he had painstakingly compiled, his mind constantly returning to one central question. What had been the true motive behind the conspiracy? Watson, ever the voice of reason, sat across from him, flipping through the final reports from Scotland Yard. "Holmes, I've been reviewing these reports from the ministers who were involved. One thing strikes me as odd. Most of them were not acting on their own initiative. They were receiving instructions from someone higher up, someone we haven't identified yet." Sherlock's eyes flicked to Watson, his mind immediately working through the implications of Watson's words. He had suspected as much. The people who had been arrested were mere pawns in a larger game. There was someone else pulling the strings, a shadowy figure in the background, a mastermind who had been orchestrating the entire scheme. "Indeed," Sherlock replied, his voice low. "These men were mere instruments, and the true conductor of the symphony has yet to reveal himself." Watson leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. "You think this mastermind is still out there, biding their time?" Sherlock nodded grimly. "Yes. The evidence doesn't add up. Even though we've captured the ringleader, the network is too vast, the players too influential for it to have been the work of a few individuals. This conspiracy was meant to destabilize the entire political system. The timing of the murders, the cabinet ministers, Whitmore's death, all point to a larger, more carefully constructed plan." A sudden knock on the door interrupted their conversation. Lestrade, ever diligent, stepped inside, a grim expression on his face. "Holmes, Watson," Lestrade said without preamble. "We've got a problem. It seems the mastermind behind the whole operation has made their move." Sherlock's eyes hardened. "What do you mean, Lestrade?" "A high-ranking official from the Foreign Office has gone missing," Lestrade explained. He was last seen in his office this morning, but his colleagues reported hearing strange noises in the corridor, like someone was trying to break in. When they investigated, his office was empty, and the only sign of disturbance was a single note left on his desk. "It's a message, Holmes, and it's directed at you." Sherlock's interest piqued. "What does it say?" Lestrade pulled a folded piece of paper from his coat pocket. He handed it to Sherlock, who read it aloud, his voice steely. "You have come far, Sherlock Holmes, but this is where the game ends. The pieces have been moved, and you are no longer in control. The next move is mine." Sherlock's eyes narrowed. The message was simple but chilling. It was a declaration of war. The mastermind was no longer hiding behind the veil of political influence. They were now making their presence felt. And Sherlock was the target. "We need to act quickly," Sherlock said, standing up abruptly. "This is not just an idle threat. This individual is trying to send a message. They want us to know they are in control." Lestrade nodded. We've already mobilized the search teams, but this could be the beginning of something much larger. Sherlock, Watson, and Lestrade made their way to the Foreign Office, where they were met with the bustling activity of Scotland Yard's finest. Sherlock's eyes scanned the scene with the practiced gaze of a hawk. The office was eerily quiet, save for the hushed murmurs of the investigators. The room where the official had last been seen was in disarray, papers scattered across the floor, as if a struggle had taken place. Sherlock knelt by the desk, his fingers brushing over the cluttered papers. His eyes narrowed as he picked up a specific document, an official report marked with the seal of the Foreign Office. It had been torn in half, the edges ragged and frayed. As Sherlock studied it, his mind began to piece together this wasn't just a random attack. This was a calculated move, an attempt to erase something important. Holmes? Watson's voice broke through Sherlock's thoughts. Do you see something? Sherlock held up the torn document. This paper was meant to be destroyed. It was torn deliberately, not in a fit of rage, but as part of a plan. Whoever did this wanted to send a clear message. They wanted to erase their tracks, but they've made a mistake. Lestrade leaned in, examining the torn document with Sherlock. What are you suggesting? That the missing official had information that our mastermind didn't want uncovered, Sherlock explained. This document is the key. It's part of a larger report, and whoever took the official wanted to ensure it never reached the public eye. Watson stepped closer, examining the torn edges. It's a government document. Could it have anything to do with the arms deals we uncovered earlier? Sherlock nodded. Exactly. This report was likely detailing further dealings, potentially involving high-level international players. Our mastermind is someone who cannot afford to let that information see the light of day. A sudden voice interrupted their analysis. It was one of the officers who had been assisting with the search. Mr. Holmes, sir, the officer called. We found something. The officer led them down a corridor to a small hidden office that had been overlooked in the initial sweep. Inside, they found something even more alarming, a large map of Europe with various locations marked in red ink. Sherlock's eyes flicked over the map with swift precision, noting the locations, military installations, ports, and key diplomatic centers. This is bigger than we thought, Sherlock muttered under his breath. This is an international operation spanning multiple countries. Watson's face darkened. This goes far beyond the docks in London, doesn't it? Indeed, Sherlock replied. This mastermind is pulling strings across borders, manipulating political events on an international scale, and we are standing on the precipice of a far larger conspiracy. The discovery of the map marked a turning point in the investigation. Sherlock knew that the missing official was no longer just a victim. He was a crucial piece of the puzzle, and his disappearance was part of a larger scheme to control the flow of international information. The pieces were falling into place, but they were scattered, and Sherlock needed to move quickly to prevent further chaos. The investigation shifted focus as Sherlock and his team delved into the international connections of the missing official. As more time passed, it became apparent that the mastermind was not acting alone. There was a network of individuals who had been involved in orchestrating the downfall of the British government from within. Sherlock knew it was only a matter of time before the mastermind made their final move. The game was drawing to a close, and the truth would soon be exposed. Part 20. The Final Act. The final confrontation came unexpectedly. Sherlock had been tracking the mastermind's movements for days, piecing together fragments of information. It became clear that the mastermind had been using the chaos to cover their own escape. But Sherlock had one advantage. The mastermind underestimated the determination and brilliance of Sherlock Holmes. After days of surveillance and careful planning, Sherlock tracked the mastermind to a secluded manor on the outskirts of London. It was here, in the quiet isolation of the countryside, that the final confrontation would take place. Sherlock, Watson, and Lestrade arrived at the manor under the cover of night. The plan was simple: take the mastermind alive and dismantle the final layer of the conspiracy before it could spread further. As they approached the manor, Sherlock's instincts told him that this was the endgame. The mastermind would not go down without a fight. Inside the manor, the mastermind awaited them, calm and composed, as if expecting the confrontation. The air was thick with tension as Sherlock and the others entered the grand foyer. The mastermind stood at the far end of the room, a figure of cold authority. "You've come," the mastermind said, their voice smooth, almost mocking. "We've come to end this," Sherlock replied, his voice firm. The mastermind smiled. "You think you've won, Sherlock Holmes? You've merely delayed the inevitable." Sherlock's eyes narrowed. "It's over. You won't escape this time." With swift precision, Sherlock and his team closed in, arresting the mastermind and bringing an end to the conspiracy. The final layer had been peeled away and the truth was finally exposed. As the mastermind was led away in handcuffs, Sherlock turned to Watson, a rare look of satisfaction crossing his face. The game was over. The conspiracy had been defeated, but the shadows of power would always linger. And for Sherlock Holmes, there would always be another mystery waiting just beyond the horizon. The end. Thank you so much for listening. We hope you enjoyed the story. Don't forget to leave a comment, letting us know which story you'd like to hear next and where you're tuning in from. We love hearing from our detective fans around the world. See you in the next adventure.